He showed up without calling, knocking only once before letting himself in like he lived there. I was standing in the kitchen, drying a plate, when he walked past me with quick, clipped steps. He didn't even say hello. He went straight to the table and set down a thick stack of papers wrapped in a rubber band. The sound of them hitting the wood was heavier than I expected. Something in my chest pulled tight as I watched him straighten the edges with a practiced hand. He told me they were simple updates, his voice too calm for how fast he was talking. I wiped my hands on a towel and moved closer, trying to read the top page from where I stood. The print was small, packed with lines and blanks. He kept pushing the stack toward me, telling me not to worry about the details. There was a sharpness in his tone that didn't belong in casual family talk. It wasn't concern, it was instruction. I sat down slowly, keeping my eyes on him instead of the papers. He avoided my stare and kept rearranging the documents as if he needed them in the perfect order before I touched them. He said, "Everyone eventually needs someone younger to step in." The words dropped between us with a weight he didn't seem to notice. I didn't answer. His smile tightened in a way that didn't reach his eyes. When I reached for the first page, he placed his hand over mine, pressing my fingers down against the paper. "You don't need to read through all that," he said, lowering his voice as if he were soothing a child. "It's just routine stuff. We can make this quick." His hand was warm, but the pressure was wrong. Too firm, too directed. I pulled mine back and watched his jaw set for half a second before he recovered the friendly tone he'd walked in with. He flipped through the stack, pointing to signature lines he hadn't explained. Words like transfer, access, and co-ownership slid across the pages as if they were harmless labels. I traced them with my eyes, feeling each one settle deeper than the last. Every line felt like a step in a direction I hadn't agreed to take. He talked over my silence, filling the room with phrases that didn't match the speed of his breathing. The air felt tight around us. When I asked what the papers were actually for, he didn't answer directly. He said it was all recommended these days. He said handling things alone was risky at my age. He said the bank liked when families were organized. Every sentence sounded practiced, like he'd been coached or had practiced the script himself. He pushed the pen toward me, the tip rolling across the table until it stopped against my wrist. I didn't pick it up. He noticed. His knee began bouncing under the table, just a little, just enough for me to see he wasn't as calm as he wanted to appear. Then he did something that froze me in place. He looked toward the door, quick, sharp, expectant. It wasn't casual. It wasn't habit. It was the look of someone waiting for a signal or a moment or another person who was supposed to arrive. The house felt smaller in that instant. The papers, the pen, the rush in his voice. They all lined up in a way I hadn't seen before he looked away. He cleared his throat and slid the top page closer again, covering half the table. "Just sign the first one," he said. "We can take care of the rest later." I kept my hands in my lap, feeling the weight of his urgency press against the room. Nothing about this visit was simple. Nothing about those papers was routine. And the longer I watched him, the more certain I became that I wasn't the one he expected to take the next step. After my wife passed, the house changed in ways I didn't expect. The walls didn't make the same sounds at night, and the kitchen stayed cleaner than it ever had when she was here. I tried to keep my routine steady, but there's an emptiness that settles in when a voice you once heard every morning is no longer there. I learned to live with the stillness, though some evenings felt longer than they should. The quiet didn't frighten me, but it made me aware of how different life becomes when you're the only one left to keep it moving. The first time my nephew started visiting more often was after my minor health scare. It wasn't serious, just a dizzy spell that landed me in the clinic for a few hours. Word spread faster than I liked, and within a week he was at my door, carrying groceries I didn't ask for and checking the medicine cabinet as if looking for evidence I couldn't manage things alone. He said he just wanted to help, and at the time, I let him. It felt good to have company, even if his visits were oddly timed. He started offering to handle small things, sorting bills, checking mail, renewing subscriptions. He spoke confidently, like he knew better ways to run my home. I didn't mind the help at first, but there was something in his tone that made me pay attention. He talked to me the way people talk when they're certain they'll be the one making decisions soon. I tried ignoring it, thinking maybe he was just trying too hard. But the unease didn't disappear. It grew clearer when he began interrupting me during conversations. I'd start to explain something, and he'd finish the sentence before I got halfway through. He'd correct me on details I knew were right, telling me I must be misremembering or mixing things up. It wasn't aggressive. It was subtle, almost careful. But I felt the shift every time it happened, like he was slowly replacing my words with his own. I noticed how he leaned forward when I spoke, not to listen, but to evaluate, as if he was keeping score. He started asking about money more frequently, not bluntly, but always with the same phrasing. Just making sure you're comfortable. He'd ask what my bills usually ran, or whether I had any automatic deductions, or how much I normally kept in savings. Every question was framed as concern, but concern usually comes with patience, and he had none. He always pushed a little too far, as though he needed numbers more than reassurance. I tried brushing off the pattern, telling myself it was the natural worry of a younger relative. But the feeling grew sharper each time he visited. He'd walk around the house slowly, noticing small things he never cared about before. The stack of mail on the counter, the way I arranged the cabinet where I kept my documents, the drawer where I stored stamps and envelopes. His eyes moved like someone cataloging, not checking on me. The moment that planted the first real doubt came one afternoon when we were going over my electricity bill. He tapped the paper lightly and said, "At some point, you'll want to prepare for transition." He said it casually, but the word stuck in the air. Transition, not safety, not planning. Transition, as if my life were a file that needed to be handed off. I asked what he meant, and he shrugged, saying it was just something responsible families did. But that word didn't leave my mind after he went home. There was something in how he'd said it, something practiced, not a suggestion, a step. And sitting alone in the quiet house that night, I realized the change in him hadn't come from concern. It had come from opportunity. He came by again 3 days later, letting himself in with the same quick knock he always used when he didn't want to wait for permission. I heard drawers opening before I even reached the hallway. When I stepped into the living room, he was already standing over the mail pile, flipping through envelopes like he had a deadline. He didn't seem surprised to see me watching him. He said the bank letters looked stressful and that he should store them somewhere safe so I wouldn't have to think about them. His voice carried the same false ease he used when trying to get past a subject before I could question it. He picked up one envelope and asked if I really needed to keep every month's statement. I told him I preferred handling my own paperwork. He nodded, but he didn't step back. Instead, he slid the envelopes into one neat stack, as if preparing to take them anyway. I reached out and took them first, placing them on the table beside me. His eyes followed the movement, sharp and quick. It was a small shift, but enough to make the room feel tighter. I kept the mail with me when he walked into the kitchen. While he talked about nothing important, I opened one of the bank envelopes. Inside was a notice. Unsuccessful attempt to access account details. The date on it matched a day I wasn't even home. My stomach tightened just enough for my breath to catch. I read the line twice to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. It wasn't a generic notice. It was specific, marked with the time and the failed login attempt. He asked what I was looking at, but he didn't move closer. I folded the paper and placed it inside the stack without answering. His smile shifted by a fraction, the kind of small adjustment people make when they see something they didn't plan for. He cleared his throat and said the notice was routine, adding that banks send those all the time. His tone wavered at the end, just a slight shake, but enough for me to hear the crack under his explanation. While he talked, he leaned over the counter and began scribbling something on the corner of an old grocery list. I watched his hand move. He wasn't doodling. He was copying numbers printed on one of the envelopes I hadn't yet put away. Long numbers, account numbers. He did it casually, like someone writing down a phone number from a billboard. When he realized I was watching, he folded the paper and slid it into his pocket without breaking the conversation. The ease of it made my chest feel cold. A moment later, his phone rang. He looked at the screen and froze for half a second. Then he turned the device over so I couldn't see the caller ID. Instead of answering, he pressed the side button and let it ring out. When it buzzed again, he stepped away from the counter, lowering his voice and pretending to read a message. But he didn't open anything. He just held the screen face down, waiting for the ringing to stop. His hand was shaking now, only slightly, but enough that he shoved the phone into his pocket too quickly. He murmured something about timing and follow-ups, words he tried to bury inside a pretend chuckle. They didn't match the tension in his shoulders. They didn't match the way he avoided meeting my eyes. He left earlier than usual that day, saying he had errands to run. He didn't look back as he walked out the door. After he was gone, I sat at the table with the stack of mail beside me. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet it had been after my wife passed. This one carried weight. It carried direction. And in that silence, the first real clue sat in my hands. Small, printed, impossible to ignore. I went to the bank the next morning without calling ahead. I told myself it was just to check on a few things. Nothing serious, nothing unusual. Still, I drove slower than usual, as if my mind needed time to settle into the decision. When I walked through the glass doors, the manager looked up from her desk and immediately stood. She'd known me for years, long enough to notice the hesitation in my voice when I asked if she had a moment. She didn't question it. She just nodded and led me to her office in the back. I sat across from her while she pulled up my accounts, her fingers moving across the keyboard with steady precision. She asked if there was anything specific I was worried about. I told her I'd received a notice about an attempted login, and I wanted to make sure everything was normal. She didn't say anything at first. She just adjusted her glasses and leaned in closer to the screen, her expression tightening slightly. Then she scrolled again, slower this time, as if confirming the pattern before speaking. She turned the monitor slightly toward me and pointed to a list of recent access attempts. More than one, more than two, several, all from a device that wasn't mine, and at times I wasn't awake. There was nothing dramatic in her voice, but the quiet weight of her explanation struck harder than if she'd raised it. Multiple attempts, all unsuccessful, all from the same unidentified device. She asked if anyone else had permission to access these accounts. I told her no. She hesitated before clicking into a different tab, one with forms I hadn't seen before. She explained that someone had tried to register themselves as my financial overseer, a designation used when a client is aging and needs long-term support. My breath caught, but I kept my face steady. She showed me the request, not approved, but submitted. My nephew's name was on it, cleanly typed, listed as primary contact. She asked again, politely, carefully, if there was anyone who might believe they were helping me. I shook my head. She nodded as if she expected that answer, then documented the unauthorized attempts and locked the account from any future inquiries unless I appeared in person. The room felt colder with every click of her mouse. The soft hum of the computer suddenly sounded too loud, filling the space between us. She wasn't dramatic, not even close. She explained procedures the way professionals do when they need you to understand, without falling apart. She said attempts like these are rarely random. They usually come after a pattern of concerned relatives, easing their way into someone's finances. She didn't accuse my nephew of anything. She didn't need to. The pattern she described matched the last few months of my life too precisely to ignore. I asked her to show me the exact dates of the attempts. She printed them out and slid the pages across the desk. They lined up almost perfectly with the days he'd visited or called, asking about my bills. The alignment wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that forces clarity into places you were trying not to examine too closely. When she finished securing the accounts, she rested her hand briefly on the printed pages. "Keep these somewhere safe," she said. Not a warning, not a prediction, just professional advice delivered in a tone that understood more than it stated. I folded the papers carefully and placed them inside my jacket. As I walked out of the bank, the automatic doors opened with their usual hiss, but the air outside felt different. He hadn't stumbled into this. He hadn't made a mistake. He had a plan, and now I had proof it wasn't an accident. He showed up that evening with a confidence that didn't match the situation. I heard it in the way he knocked, fast, sharp, not waiting for me to reach the door. When I opened it, he brushed past me with a grin that stretched too wide across his face. He walked into the living room like a man who already believed the future belonged to him. He didn't bother with small talk. He sat down, leaned back, and let out a long breath as if today had been a victory. He started talking before I could ask what he needed. His words came loose, spilling out in a way people speak when they think the finish line is in sight. He said things were finally moving the way they should. He said some people were on board now. His voice carried a rhythm, almost celebratory, but his eyes kept darting toward the stack of my mail on the table. He didn't hide the interest anymore. He didn't need to. He believed he was too close to winning for caution. Then he said something that made the room feel smaller. He laughed and said he had promised someone the house would be sold by the end of the year. Promised. Not suggested, not discussed. He didn't even realize he'd said it until I asked what he meant. His smile slipped slightly, but he covered it by talking faster, saying there were timelines to consider and final steps to handle. He used those phrases like they were part of a project plan he'd been rehearsing. I kept my face steady, letting him feel comfortable enough to keep talking. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing something clever. He said a few relatives had expressed concern about my health. Then, with a tone that made my stomach tighten, he admitted he'd told them I'd been declining mentally. He said it casually, as if discussing someone else's bad memory. He didn't look at me while saying it. He stared at my bookshelf, scanning titles with the confidence of someone already imagining the room without them. I didn't interrupt. He took my silence as permission to continue. He said he had prepared versions of documents to help speed things up. Versions, not suggestions. Versions. The word hung between us like a blade. He said he had printed them out because sometimes older people get overwhelmed seeing too many options. He laughed after saying it, a short, careless laugh that revealed far more than he intended. When he reached into his bag and pulled out a folder, I felt the temperature of the room shift. He placed it on the table and opened it halfway, showing clean, typed pages filled with structured language. Statements about cognitive decline, questions about decision-making, sections outlining assumed responsibilities. Each page was formatted in a way that made my hands feel cold. These weren't casual notes. These were formal preparations. He said we needed to move forward soon. He said dragging out the process would only make things harder. He said delaying could complicate the final outcome. Every sentence confirmed the same truth. He had built a narrative where I was no longer myself. He had written a version of my life where he was in charge, and he believed he was close enough now that he didn't need to hide it. The stakes sharpened with every word he spoke. He wasn't speculating. He wasn't exploring possibilities. He was planning. He had told people I was fading. He had printed proof the story was already written, and now he was waiting for the moment when he could put my signature on the final step. He stayed only a few minutes longer, long enough to gather the folder and place it back in his bag with careful confidence. He patted my shoulder on his way out, the gesture too familiar, too certain. Then he left the house, humming softly, like a man satisfied with his progress. When the door closed behind him, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt timed. He wasn't guessing. He was executing. And the danger wasn't approaching anymore. It was already inside the house. I went back to the bank the next morning with the folder he'd shown me the night before. I didn't call ahead or schedule anything. I just walked in, holding the papers under my arm, feeling the weight of them with each step. The manager looked up from her desk when I entered, and the moment she saw my face, she stood and guided me toward her office without asking a single question. She closed the door quietly behind us and waited for me to sit before taking her seat. I placed the folder on her desk and told her I needed her to look at something carefully. She opened it and started reading through the first few pages. Her expression didn't change at first. She kept her professional calm, scanning line by line the way people do when they're trying to understand the purpose behind something. But as she moved deeper into the stack, her jaw tightened. Her fingers paused on the edge of one page, holding it longer than the others. She didn't rush. She read every word. When she reached the final document, she closed the folder gently and looked at me with an expression that held no confusion, only concern. Her voice stayed even as she asked how these papers ended up in my hands. I told her who brought them and when. She sat back slowly and folded her hands on the desk. The quiet in the room was heavy, not dramatic, just the kind of quiet that comes when someone recognizes a problem that has been building for a while. Then she asked the question with a steady voice. "Who's forcing you?" It wasn't loud. It wasn't emotional. It was a diagnosis delivered plainly, the same way a doctor names an illness they've seen many times before. Hearing it made something settle inside me. Not relief, not fear, just clarity. She opened the folder again and tapped on a paragraph written near the top. She explained that these were classic financial control documents, forms designed to shift authority slowly, allowing someone else to manage accounts, transfer property, or make decisions in the best interest of the elder. She said the language was crafted to appear harmless, but carried clauses that could be used to override my decisions if someone pushed the narrative far enough. Her tone remained factual. She wasn't trying to scare me. She was telling me the truth. She showed me another page and pointed out a section referencing diminished capacity. Someone had filled in parts of it, not fully, but enough to see where the intent was heading. She said the wording suggested my nephew was preparing to claim authority on the grounds of incompetence, not openly, not with accusations, quietly, step by step, the way these situations usually unfold. She asked whether anyone else had been involved, or if he had mentioned any legal or medical steps. I told her only what I knew, nothing more. She nodded, making notes without judgment, but with a seriousness that confirmed this wasn't a misunderstanding. She said attempts like this often start with access requests, then progress to story building, comments about forgetfulness, concerns about safety, hints to relatives. The pattern matched everything I'd been seeing. She advised me, in a calm professional tone, to secure every important document, property deeds, identification, financial records. She told me to keep them somewhere unreachable and to make copies for a legal representative if I had one, not as a dramatic measure, as a protective one. She said I should consider formal legal protection before my nephew attempted to file anything himself. Her instructions were simple, practical, grounded in procedure. When our meeting ended, she placed the folder back in my hands and walked me to the office door. Her expression didn't show fear, only urgency. The kind of urgency that tells you time hasn't run out, but it isn't something you can ignore anymore. Walking out into the daylight, I felt a steadiness I hadn't felt in days. Not because the threat vanished, because it had been named. And now I understood exactly what I was facing. I spent the next morning gathering every document that still carried my name alone. I pulled the metal box from the back of the closet, the one I hadn't opened since my wife passed, and laid everything out on the dining table. Property deeds, insurance records, identification cards, bank statements, the simple paperwork that suddenly felt like armor. I checked each page, making sure nothing had been altered or replaced. When I was sure everything was intact, I slipped the originals into a new folder and hid them in a place he'd never think to look. The act didn't calm me, but it centered me. It reminded me I still had control. Once everything was secure, I drove to my attorney's office. I hadn't needed him in years, but when I spoke to the receptionist, she recognized my voice and found a spot for me immediately. The attorney listened without interrupting as I explained what had happened. The documents, the inquiries, the bank manager's question. He didn't react with shock. He reacted with experience. He'd seen situations like this before, enough times to know how predictable the steps could become. He outlined the protections we could file and the boundaries we needed to draw. Nothing dramatic, just measured procedures to keep the law on my side. He asked if I had the documents with me. I placed the folder on his desk. He flipped through each page with the same steady calm the bank manager had used, nodding occasionally, marking items with small tabs. He made copies to store at the office, then handed the originals back to me with the same quiet seriousness. "Keep these with you," he said. "Don't leave them where anyone else can get to them." I thanked him and felt something settle inside me. Not relief, not confidence, but direction. The path forward was no longer a fog. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed in my pocket. When I checked it, I saw my nephew's name. I let it ring. A minute later, it rang again and again. By the fifth call, he left a voicemail telling me he had urgent paperwork we needed to finalize. His tone was sharp, impatient, not worried, pressing. The more he insisted, the clearer his intentions became. He wasn't contacting me to help. He was contacting me to accelerate whatever he believed was almost finished. That evening, he called once more. I answered this time but softened my voice, letting it sound slower than usual. I told him I had been resting and wasn't sure what day he meant. His tone shifted instantly. He spoke to me like someone handing instructions to a distracted child. He said he'd come by the next day and walk me through everything. He even laughed at the end, a light, practiced sound that made the words feel cleaner than they were. He didn't realize I was listening for the parts he wasn't saying. After the call, I sat at the table for a long moment. The house was still, but the tension in the air felt different now, not threatening, strategic. Each step I took put me one measure ahead of him, and each call he made showed how close he believed he was to the end. That was useful. A man who thinks he's already won becomes careless. I reviewed the documents again, placing them in a secure folder I could access quickly. I called the attorney and told him I wanted him present when the meeting happened. He agreed and told me to set the time. There was no anger in me, just clarity. Clean, sharp, deliberate. The confrontation needed to happen soon. Not rushed, not emotional. On my terms, with evidence ready and witnesses in place. And I knew exactly how to make that happen. He arrived right on time, walking into the house with the same confidence he'd shown the night he slipped. He carried a new folder under his arm, thinner than the last one, but held with more certainty. He didn't sit right away. He stood over the coffee table, placing the folder down like it was the solution to a problem only he understood. Then he softened his voice, asking how I was feeling today, adding that he hoped I got some rest. The concern sounded shaped, not genuine, like something he rehearsed in the car before coming inside. He finally sat, leaning forward and opening the folder with slow, deliberate care. He said we should go through the final documents together, and that it would only take a minute. He slid the first page toward me and pointed at the signature line, avoiding the paragraphs above it. His tone had the same mix of warmth and urgency he'd used before, a blend meant to push without looking like pressure. He repeated that this was for my own ease and would prevent confusion later. Every sentence was polished, every pause controlled. I didn't touch the page. Instead, I asked him to explain the financial wording at the top, the part he'd skipped over. He blinked, then gave an answer that didn't match what he'd told me last week. I asked a second question, this time about the medical clause. His voice caught for half a second before he recovered with another explanation that contradicted his first. I didn't raise my voice. I just kept asking the kind of questions that required precision, not speed. With each one, his certainty drained a little more. He leaned back, realizing the rhythm he relied on wasn't working. He tried changing the subject, telling me not to overthink, and that everything had been handled already. He slid the pen closer, tapping it once against the table, but before he could guide the conversation back into his script, I told him we had a few people joining us. His hand froze mid-tap. He asked who. I didn't answer. A moment later, the knock came. He stiffened. When I opened the door, the attorney walked in first, carrying a formal-looking folder. Right behind him, the bank manager stepped inside with her clipboard and a calm, steady expression that didn't show a trace of hesitation. My nephew's face drained a shade lighter the moment he saw them. He tried to stand, then sat back down when neither of them spoke. The attorney placed his folder on the table and opened it. The bank manager did the same. They began laying out documents one by one, login attempt logs, printed inquiry records, the registration request listing him as financial overseer, the drafts he had prepared describing me as cognitively declining, the valuation notes tied to my property. Each page was placed neatly in front of him, forming a line of evidence that left no room for interpretation. My nephew didn't say a word. His breathing changed first, short and shallow. His hand moved toward the folder he'd brought, then stopped halfway. He looked between the three of us, me, the attorney, the manager, realizing none of us were guessing. Every step he'd taken was documented. Every detail he thought was hidden had been recorded. The bank manager spoke quietly, explaining the pattern of attempted control. The attorney added brief legal notes, each one factual, each one clear. My nephew's shoulders sank until he was almost folded into himself. His confidence, the one he carried into the room like armor, broke without a sound. He finally whispered that there must be some misunderstanding. The attorney slid the evidence closer. The manager calmly refuted his excuse. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The truth was on the table, lined up in black ink. When he stood to leave, he didn't look at the papers. He didn't look at me. He just walked out quietly, the way people do when they realize the ground they were standing on never belonged to them. The house felt colder after the door closed, but the air was clear, finally clear. The attorney moved fast. By the next morning, he had filed the papers to secure my estate, ensuring no one could claim authority without my direct approval. He explained each step in calm, simple terms, showing me where my nephew had attempted to wedge himself into decisions that were never his to make. Hearing it laid out in the attorney's office made everything feel heavier, but it also brought a sense of grounding I hadn't felt in months. For the first time, someone was acting on my side instead of around me. Later that afternoon, the police came by to take an initial statement. They didn't arrive with urgency or raised voices, just steady professionalism. They asked about the documents, the attempts to access my accounts, the pressure he had applied in my own home. I gave them the folder my attorney prepared, each page organized in a timeline that left little room for doubt. The officers read quietly, exchanging looks that told me this wasn't the first case like mine they had seen. Their questions were careful, measured, and respectful. They contacted my nephew the same evening. I wasn't present for their questioning, but one of the officers called afterward to confirm he had been cooperative but evasive. He claimed everything was a misunderstanding, that he was only trying to help, but the officers already had the bank logs, the drafts, and the attempted authority request. His explanations couldn't cover the pattern. The inquiry moved forward without hesitation. Over the next few days, word spread through the family. A cousin called to ask why the police had visited my nephew's house. A niece reached out, confused and embarrassed, admitting she had heard rumors about my declining state. I didn't argue with them or defend myself. I simply explained the truth. I was fine, and someone else had hoped I wouldn't be. Those were hard words to say out loud, harder than I expected. They carried weight that didn't leave quickly. At home, I took practical steps the attorney recommended. I changed the locks, not out of fear, but out of responsibility to myself. I updated every account, removed old access points, and set new protections with the bank. I stored my documents in a secure place only I knew. Each task was small, but together they rebuilt something I hadn't realized was damaged, my sense of control. When I finished, I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the empty chair across from me. For a moment, I let myself feel the quiet. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't painful either. It was something in between, a kind of sober understanding that trust, once misused, doesn't return on command. I thought about how easily I had accepted help when he first offered it, how simple it had seemed to let someone younger handle a few things. I hadn't questioned the shift until it was nearly too late. I didn't blame myself. That surprised me. I expected anger or regret, but what settled instead was clarity. People show their intentions through consistency, not moments. His pattern had been forming slowly, piece by piece, until the picture was too clear to ignore. By the end of the week, the attorney called. Protective measures were approved. My nephew was formally barred from handling any part of my finances. The inquiry would continue, and I would be informed of each step. I thanked him, not for the legal work, but for treating me like a capable man instead of a fading one. That night, when I locked the front door, the sound felt final in a way I didn't expect. The house wasn't safer because of metal and hinges. It was safer because I had taken back what was mine. I stood there for a moment, letting the stillness settle. Vindication didn't feel triumphant. It felt steady, heavy, real, but it was enough. The house felt different once everything was secured. It was quiet in a way that didn't scrape against my nerves anymore. I sat in my living room with the evening light fading across the floor, the paperwork neatly stored in the drawer beside me. No one else had access to anything now. No one could walk in and steer my life in a direction I didn't choose. The stillness wasn't comforting, but it wasn't threatening either. It simply told the truth. Safety sometimes comes at the cost of company. I leaned back in the chair I've had for 20 years and let my thoughts settle. People imagine betrayal arrives loudly, with shouting and slammed doors. But the kind that hurts a man my age rarely sounds like that. It comes quiet. It wears polite smiles and familiar voices. It creeps in through offers to handle things or take something off your plate. You don't notice the shift until you're already standing too close to the edge. I thought about the first time my nephew helped me with a bill after my health scare. It seemed harmless then. It felt like kindness. But looking back, I can see how each small moment held a different intention beneath the surface. Entitlement rarely announces itself. It hides behind soft words, acting as if it deserves what you spent a lifetime building. And if you're not paying attention, you start giving away authority piece by piece. The truth is, getting older doesn't make you blind. It doesn't make you helpless. It just makes people assume you are. That assumption can be dangerous when someone decides your age is an opportunity. I learned that the hard way, not because I was weak, because I believed family was the one place I didn't need to be guarded. I trusted the wrong person, and he counted on that trust to open doors he couldn't push through honestly. As I sat there, I realized something important. Self-respect isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It stands quietly in the corner, waiting for you to remember it. When I finally acted, when I secured my documents and told the truth, something inside me settled back into place. I wasn't fighting to keep money or property. I was fighting to keep the dignity I earned over a lifetime of work. I wish I could say the betrayal didn't leave a mark. It did. It changed the way I look at the people around me, not with bitterness, but with clearer eyes. I no longer assume that concern and control are the same thing. I no longer confuse family ties with automatic loyalty. A man my age doesn't have the luxury of blind trust. Every signature matters. Every decision carries weight. And every hand reaching toward your life deserves to be questioned. If another older man ever asked me what I learned through all this, I'd keep the answer simple. Document everything. Know where your papers are. Ask direct questions. Don't let shame keep you silent when something feels wrong. Age gives you experience, not weakness, unless you surrender your judgment to someone who hasn't earned it. I stood up slowly, feeling the steady strength in my legs. The house around me was the same one I had lived in for decades, but tonight it felt more firmly mine. Not because of the locks, not because of the legal protections, but because I made the choice to protect it, to protect myself. As I turned off the lamp, I let one final truth settle in my mind, one I hoped I wouldn't forget again. Growing old doesn't make you powerless. Trusting without caution does.